My parents ignored my 17 calls while I was dying. A stranger who paid my bill exposed them. I never imagined that the hardest part of almost dying wouldn't be the pain. It would be discovering exactly who cared enough to answer the phone. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. My car skidded across the highway after another driver lost control. Metal screamed against metal, airbags exploded into my face, and everything went black for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, blood was running down my forehead, and I couldn't move my left leg. A passing driver called an ambulance. While the paramedics worked frantically around me, one of them handed me my phone. "If there's someone you trust," he said gently, "call them." My parents were the first people I thought of. I called Mom. No answer. I called Dad. Straight to voicemail. I called again and again. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, I had made 17 calls between my parents, leaving desperate voicemails that simply said, "Please, I need you." Not one call was returned. Hours later, doctors explained that I needed emergency surgery. My insurance had unexpectedly lapsed because of an employer paperwork mistake, and the hospital required an immediate financial guarantee before performing additional procedures. Lying there in unbearable pain, I realized I was completely alone. Then a man I'd never seen before stepped into my room. He introduced himself as Michael. "I was the driver behind the crash," he explained. "I followed the ambulance because I wanted to make sure you survived." I thanked him weakly. He looked at the paperwork on the bedside table, quietly picked it up, walked into the hallway, and disappeared. 20 minutes later, a nurse returned with tears in her eyes. "Everything's taken care of," she whispered. "What do you mean? The gentleman paid your entire hospital deposit." I couldn't believe it. A complete stranger had done what my own family wouldn't. The surgery saved my life. During recovery, Michael visited every afternoon. He brought books, coffee, and terrible jokes that somehow made me laugh despite the stitches across my chest. Meanwhile, my parents remained silent. 3 days later, they finally appeared. Not because they had listened to my voicemails. They had seen a social media post where someone mentioned the highway accident. Mom rushed into my room pretending to cry. Dad immediately asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I stared at him. I called 17 times. He frowned. "We were busy." Michael happened to be standing near the window. He quietly walked over and placed my phone on the bedside table. "I listened to every voicemail," he said calmly. "Your child begged for help." The room became painfully silent. Then he turned the screen toward them. Every missed call, every unanswered voicemail, every timestamp. 17 chances. 17 decisions. Dad tried to explain that they had assumed it wasn't serious. Michael didn't raise his voice. Instead, he asked one question. "If these calls had been from your boss instead of your child, would you have answered?" Neither of them spoke. The silence was louder than any excuse. Before leaving, Michael handed me a folder. Inside was the receipt for every hospital payment he had made. Attached to it was a handwritten note. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who refuse to let you face your worst day alone. I cried harder reading those words than I had after the accident. My parents never apologized. They only complained that Michael had embarrassed them. But he hadn't exposed them. Their own choices had. Months later, after physical therapy, I walked again. The first people cheering at my final rehabilitation session weren't my parents. They weren't even relatives. It was Michael, the nurses, and the paramedics who had never stopped believing I'd recover. That day, I finally understood something that changed my life forever. The people who answer when you're at your weakest are the ones who truly deserve a place in your strongest moments. Blood may create relatives, but compassion creates family.